Hey, what's up? It's Zax, and I got a quick tier list for you. This one is about New World, and what I think are the best weapons for leveling by yourself. I'm pretty much just talking about leveling in PvE, so just going around doing quests, killing mobs, not really including PvP or doing like group content and expeditions or elite zones or anything like that. So yeah, just solo PvE. The reason why I want to make this video is because I played a ridiculous amount of the open beta weekend, and I spent the vast majority of my time playing alone, testing out every single weapon to see which ones I would want to use when the game came out. And I want to potentially help your leveling experience go a little bit smoother than mine did. And I want to preface this list with a couple things. The first being that I didn't get an infinite amount of time to test all these weapons, so a lot of my opinions are based on like the first half of the leveling in the game. But for what it's worth, I also have done a ton of research into what these weapons will end up like in the end game. So I think I have a pretty good idea of how all this stuff's gonna play out. The second thing is that this list is mostly based on efficiency. And by efficiency, I mean obviously being able to kill mobs fast, but also not having much downtime between them. So of course you wanna do a bunch of damage, but there are some other factors that really speed things up. And finally, I wanna say that solo PvE leveling can be done with any of these weapons easily. So this tier list isn't really about what's viable, it's more so just about what I've found makes things go by faster in a good way. Anyway, let's get into it. I'm gonna do a random order here, and I'm gonna talk about some pros and cons for each weapon so you kind of get an idea of what's actually good and bad about it instead of just my feelings. So first one we got is the bow. I'm putting the bow in C tier, and let's start off with the pros. First of all, obviously it's a ranged weapon, which is a good thing. If you can hit your shots and use your abilities well, you'll kill the mobs before they ever get to you, which means you don't take any damage and you don't have to take time to heal up in between mobs. And the bow can actually do a ton of damage if you hit your shots well. Also, the bow provides probably the most consistent movement speed increase out of all the weapons. If you talent into it right, you can maintain almost a permanent 20% movement speed increase, which really helps getting around in this game because there can be a lot of auto running. But that's pretty much all I got for pros. As for the cons, the first big one for me at least, I know this is kind of like a personal thing, but you have to worry about ammo. You don't have infinite arrows in this game, so you have to constantly make sure that you're gonna have enough arrows whenever you're about to get into a combat situation. The game does make this pretty easy with the bow. You can buy the arrows or you can make them pretty much on the fly at a campfire, but for me that's just a really annoying maintenance thing to have to worry about that you don't have to worry about with any other weapon other than the musket. But if you don't care about that too much, it's kind of a wash. Another big kind of obvious con with the bow is that you actually have to hit your shots, and it can be really hard in this game. You're shooting an actual projectile with the bow that you have to like lead your shots and account for like drop in the arrow, and that can make things a little more complicated. Not to mention that hitting headshots in this game is ridiculously hard because mobs are always moving and they all have tiny heads. So there goes a whole lot of crit damage value. Also, when mobs get close to you, the bow feels almost useless and you're better off just switching to a melee weapon and going it down. Oh, and finally, doing 2 target or AoE damage with the bow is not really a thing. There are a couple abilities with the bow that you can take that do AoE damage, but they have really long cooldowns and they really don't do that much, especially compared to a big melee weapon that you can just auto attack and it does AoE damage. The bow, as far as I've seen, is pretty much only single target, so if you end up in a situation where you're fighting more than one thing, you just gotta deal with them one by one. But overall, I do still find the bow really fun to play with, and I would recommend it as just having it as an off weapon for the mobility and just getting around the map. Alright, next weapon is the fire staff, and I also have this in C tier. The pros. The fire staff is another ranged weapon, so again you have the potential to kill a mob before it ever gets to you if you hit all your shots and you hit your abilities and all that good stuff. And you don't have to worry about ammo if that's something you care about. And finally, the abilities you have with the fire staff do hit extremely hard if you can hit them, which leads me into the cons. It's hard to actually hit your abilities with the fire staff, let alone the auto attacks, which are kind of similar to the bow where they're actually a projectile coming from your weapon. It's really just something that comes with ranged weapons in general. You get the benefit of being able to hit from range, but that also means you can miss. Oh, and that reminds me, with the fire staff and the bow as well, and every other projectile in this game, they get pretty hard countered by enemies that can block, or if they have a shield, it's over. In which case, you'll probably want to switch to a melee weapon and use a heavy attack to break the block. But the vast majority of enemies in the game don't block, so that's not something you have to worry about too much. Another thing is that it seems pretty clear that all of the abilities with the fire staff are more intended for AoE situations, which is not something you're generally going to be doing solo leveling. leveling. That being said, in group content and dungeons and stuff like that, the fire staff is going to be insane when the mobs are all focused on somebody else and you get to just go to town with all your AoE abilities. Oh, and last two things, you have to worry about mana, which is kind of in the same department as ammo. It can kind of be annoying to deal with, but the game does give you ways to be more efficient with mana and actually gain it back in some ways, so you can kind of work around it. And the final thing is that the fire staff gets hard countered by ancient enemies. There's this whole system in the game where different enemies have different resistances to different damage types. All the physical weapons are also included in this, but all of their bonuses and negatives are a lot smaller as compared to the fire staff, which if you're fighting ancients gets a 40% damage reduction, which is kind of intense. On the flip side, you get 30% extra damage to angry earth, I think, so if you're ever fighting those, the fire staff is awesome. But to me, the fact that your weapon can get pretty hard countered by just an enemy type is kind of bad to me, at least when we're just ranking the weapons by themselves. But overall, again, I think this weapon is going to be an absolute powerhouse in group content, so if you do plan on doing a lot of that, try it out. Now we move on to the Great Axe, which I am putting in A tier. We got our first melee weapon, and this thing is kind of crazy. The pros are it does a ton of damage, and with that it does kind of automatic cleave damage really well, which does come in handy if you ever find yourself fighting more than one thing. But the thing for me that really puts it in A tier for this list is that you can spec into a significant amount of lifesteal. Healing is hard to come by when you're playing by yourself in this game, and a little bit goes a long way with efficiency. It just makes chaining kills together all that easier. As for the cons, I would say the abilities are pretty underwhelming for a solo leveling situation, so they don't feel all that impactful, and they have really long cooldowns, so you'll be relying a ton on just auto attacking, which with the Great Axe is still really good, but that's pretty much the only con, so overall, pretty good choice. Next we got the Hatchet. Oh, the Hatchet. Easy S tier, everybody knows it. Every tier list you'll see, it's gonna be an S tier, and there's a good reason for it. The most important thing it has by far is the Berserk ability, which is a cooldown that boosts your damage and speed for a little bit, which is awesome, but most importantly, every time you press it, you get 30% of your HP back automatically. So in terms of efficiency, you just can't beat the Hatchet. It also does a lot of damage. It does easy cleave just like the Great Axe. And like I said, with Berserk, you get some really good mobility out of it. Not to mention, I don't know if you can really count this as a pro, but it was really fun for me. There's an ability you can take that allows you to yeet yourself off of cliffs. And that was just way too much fun for me in the beta to pass up. I don't know, I'm weird. Oh, also, how could I forget? You can ultimately spec into the only cheat death in the game. And it's a good cheat death, and those things are broken in every game that they're in. As for cons, it's hard to really think of any. You're mostly going to be filling out the melee talent tree, but there's a whole other tree dedicated to being able to throw your hatchet. So if you enjoy having a projectile weapon more, you can just do that, or if you find yourself in a situation where that makes more sense, Hatchet has that too. So overall, for me, this is weapon number one, period. For solo leveling, this is it. Until they nerf the Berserk ability, but we'll see if that happens. Next, we have the Ice Gauntlet, which I have in the C tier. The Ice Gauntlet is very similar to the Fire Staff. As of recording this video, they're the only two intelligence stat weapons. So it has a lot of similar pros and cons to the Fire Staff. It's a projectile weapon, so you get the benefits and challenges of being at range. It depends on mana, just like the Fire Staff, although it has less problems, I would say, with a crazy mana regen ability. But it has the same kind of feeling to me as being more oriented for AoE, which will be insane for certain situations, but probably not solo leveling. So ultimately, it's right beside the Fire Staff. They're pretty similar. Next, we have the Life Staff, which actually also goes in S tier for me. This is the only healer weapon in the game, and like I said, healing is hard to come by, so any weapon that you can heal yourself with is going to be good for solo leveling, and obviously the Life Staff can do that. As for some other pros, you can use the Life Staff effectively without putting any points into the healing stat of focus. Since you're really only healing yourself, it's not that demanding, which means it's the perfect weapon to pair with something that doesn't have any self-healing, which is almost every other weapon in the game. But also, if you do just want to use the Life Staff and you put a ton of points into focus, it actually does a ton of damage, and it doesn't get hard countered by certain enemy types like the other magic weapons, which as far as I've seen, it's at least neutral with every enemy type. And if you do ever find yourself in a group scenario out in the world or otherwise, being able to tag stuff from far away with the life staff, or just being able to help keep the group alive, is definitely something you'll be glad you have. The only real con to me of the life staff is that it ultimately does do less damage than probably every other weapon in the game. It's definitely not terrible, but it is what it is. It just complements every other weapon in the game so well that it's hard not to put it in S tier. Everyone's gonna want to use a life staff at some point. Alright, next we have the Musket, which I put alongside the bow in C tier. Very similar to the bow, but I would put the Musket just a little bit ahead of it because it is a hit scan weapon. You don't actually have to worry about a traveling projectile, which of course makes it way easier to hit your shots. Other than that, it has pretty much every same pro and con as the bow, except the ammo thing, which you may or may not care about, becomes even worse with the Musket because the ammo is harder to make. If you enjoy making it, or if you only ever buy your ammo, maybe that's not a big deal. But to me, that was a huge bummer. It will at least always be fun to run around hitting headshots with the Musket, so you get what you pay for, I guess. Anyway, on to the Rapier, which I have in B tier, and I'm gonna combine this with the Spear since it's next up anyway, and they're in the same tier and they're super similar. As for pros, both of these weapons do decent damage, both leaning more towards single target damage, which is what you're gonna be doing solo leveling mostly anyway, but ultimately both of these weapons felt a little underwhelming to me. They just felt like they did less damage than the other options, and believe me, I tried everything I could to make these good, and they're solid, but to me there's just better options that do the same thing or have other benefits on top. To me, they're kind of just the average options, although I have heard that they can be insane in PvP, but this list is not about that. I wish I had more pros and cons to give you on these, but they just really didn't strike me one way or another. I don't know what to say. Anyway, next we got the Sword and Shield, which I'm also putting into B tier, although I would say definitely behind the Rapier and Spear. The Sword and Shield, as you'd guess, is ultimately the tank weapon. Technically, you don't have to use a shield, and you can go purely into the damage tree, which I tried a lot, and the damage just felt a bit underwhelming, kind of like the Rapier and Spear, to the point where I almost want to put it in C tier, but the fact that you can pair the sword with the shield and gain a ridiculous amount of defensive value easily brings us up to a B. Ultimately, it's not going to be super efficient to go super defensive, but if you play things right, that is a good way to cut down on healing time, and the damage from the sword really isn't all that bad. But overall, if you do ever want to tank in this game in group content, you're gonna be using the Sword and Shield. So if that's your thing, it really ain't that bad. Alright, and last but definitely not least, we have the Warhammer, which I am putting in A tier. I gotta admit, this is a personal favorite of mine, so maybe a little bit biased, but I would argue that for solo leveling, this thing is underrated. It just does such a ridiculous amount of burst single target damage that you'll frequently be killing mobs in 2, maybe 3 hits, which doesn't give the mob a lot of time to do any damage to you. The weapon is really slow to swing, that's kind of the idea, kind of like the Great Axe, but one of the crazy things you can do with this weapon, and really every weapon in the game, but definitely with the Warhammer, is cancel the end of your regular attack animation with an ability to kind of shorten the time between your attacks. So you can wind up a huge heavy attack with this thing, and then right after that hits, press one of your abilities and it'll instantly start up. So you just do a stupid amount of damage in no time. Not to mention that if you get all the abilities in the left side tree, you're gonna have 3 abilities on relatively short cooldowns that all function like that. So a lot of my time with this weapon leveling was spent running up to a mob, heavy attacking it, instantly using an ability, it probably dies. If it doesn't, I hit it with another light attack, it dies, I take no damage. Move on to the next enemy where I still have 2 of my 3 abilities ready. Big heavy attack ability, it probably dies. If it doesn't die, another light attack. Move on to another enemy, I still have an ability left that does a lot of damage. Big heavy attack, last ability, the mob probably dies. And then by that time, my first ability is probably up, and you end up just chaining your abilities together like that. I didn't get this feeling of efficiency from any other weapon, at least like I said with solo leveling. And the fact that you can get the grit effect on almost all of your attacks is ridiculous, but I don't even want to get into that. I would say the main con for this weapon and what keeps it out of S tier is the simple fact that it does no self-healing. In my opinion, you're gonna need an off weapon to help heal yourself up for whenever you do take damage, which is easily done, but I just want to rate it for what it can do by itself. Alright, and that's my list. As you can see, there's kind of a general format to this list. At the top are the self-healing weapons and the ones that do the most damage. You've got the average melee weapons in the B tier and all of the ranged weapons in C tier. And I just want to say again that the margins between these tiers really aren't all that big. These are just the differences that I experienced leveling, so take it for what you will. Every single one of these weapons in the game is fun to use. I would recommend trying out every single one of these, and for sure there's going to be stuff that I missed and probably things will change. Like the Hatchet, for instance, could drop a lot if they take the heal away from Berserk or something like that. And the Musket and bow probably move up a tier or two depending on how good you are at actually hitting the shots. But ultimately, this is what I got and I'm sticking to it. So let me know what you think about this tier list. Hopefully it at least gave you an idea of what you might want to try out first. I can already tell you I'm going to be a Hatchet Warhammer gamer, and it's going to be sick. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.